Your real life hasn't started yet. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the people who suffer most quietly are not the ones whose lives have fallen apart, but the ones still waiting for their lives to begin. Here is the premise, spoken in full, as Jung wrote it, in his essay on the stages of life, collected in Volume 8 of his collected works. Paragraph 784, he wrote, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." And I want you to sit with that phrase, will at evening have become a lie, because most of us are not lazy, and most of us are not lost. We are simply still following a program that was written for a person we no longer are, and calling the exhaustion of that a full life. Before we go further, if this kind of teaching helps you see your own life more clearly, consider staying close by subscribing, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you as easily as this one did. The first key is this: the feeling that your real life hasn't started yet is not a delay, it is a diagnosis. You tell yourself, once the promotion comes, once the children are grown, once the debt is paid, once the house is finished, then it begins. And notice how the finish line always moves. Notice how the moment you approach it, a new one appears, just past it, quietly, without your ever choosing it. And Jung taught that individuation, which he defined plainly as coming to selfhood in paragraph 266 of Volume 7, is not an event waiting on the far side of your circumstances. It is a process already running beneath them, whether you attend to it or not. So imagine a woman who tells herself for years that her real life will begin once she finally has more time once the children are older, more time once the busy season at work ends, more time once one more obligation is cleared away, and each time one condition is met, another quietly appears to take its place, not because life is unfair to her, but because the postponing itself has become the actual shape of her days. The waiting is not a pause before living, the waiting is the living, disguised as a pause, and this is what Jung meant by fate arriving from outside what was refused within. So the postponement itself, the constant pushing of the real life into next year, is not a symptom of a life not yet begun. It is a symptom of a life being lived entirely on the surface. You are not early, you are elsewhere. And elsewhere is a place the psyche cannot forgive forever. So let this be the first quiet resolution. I will stop waiting for permission to be where I already am. I will stop waiting for permission to be where I already am. The second key is this: you were handed a program in the morning of your life, and you did not write it. Your parents wrote part of it, your culture wrote part of it, your own early hungers and fears wrote the rest. And the program said something like this: secure your place, prove your worth, acquire, achieve, be seen to succeed. And Jung did not despise this program. He called it necessary, a young life rightly built around expansion and ambition, because the first half of life has a true and honest task, which is to plant yourself firmly in the world, to build a persona sturdy enough to carry you through work and love and standing among others. So understand, the program itself is not the villain here. A young person with no program at all drifts, achieves nothing, builds no footing. The trouble begins later. When the program keeps running past the age it was written for, imagine a woman who at 22 decided her worth would be measured in promotions and who is now 46, still climbing, still counting titles, still translating every quiet evening into a small failure because it produced no achievement. She is not doing anything wrong by the program's own logic. She is simply still obeying instructions meant for a much younger version of herself, and nobody ever told her the instructions had an expiration date, because a program built for morning conquest has nothing to say about the second half. It does not know how to sit still. It does not know how to lose gracefully. It does not know how to face what was set aside in the rush to arrive somewhere. A man can execute his morning program perfectly, career built, family raised, reputation intact, and still feel, standing in the middle of his own achievement, that none of it was ever quite his real life, because the program was never asking that question. It was only ever asking, did you win? And winning and living, Jung would say, are not the same inquiry at all. One is a scoreboard, the other is a self, and you can spend 40 years mastering the scoreboard while the self sits untouched in the next room. So notice this week whether your own inner voice still speaks only in the program's language. Achieve more, acquire more, prove it again, and ask quietly whether that voice still belongs to the person answering it. So here is the second resolution. I will stop mistaking my program for my selfhood. I will stop mistaking my program for my selfhood. The third key is this. Whatever you set aside to run the morning program does not disappear. It waits. Jung taught that the psyche keeps its own ledger, and what is not lived consciously does not vanish quietly. It accumulates in the shadow, denser the longer it is denied. And this is the deeper meaning behind his phrase in Ion. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside. As fate, most people hear that line and think only of the shadow's darker material, the anger, the envy, the cruelty. But the unlived life is not only made of what is shameful, it is also made of what was simply postponed, the instrument you did not learn, the country you did not see, the friendship you let go quiet, the honest sentence you did not say to someone you loved, the creative impulse you called impractical and buried under the more sensible plan. All of this sits in you unlived, and unlived material does not stay passive forever. It begins to press. It shows up as a restlessness with no name, a low static hum under an otherwise fine life, a Sunday evening dread that has nothing to do with Monday's actual tasks. And imagine a woman who spent 20 years raising a family and building a steady career, who one evening finds herself standing in her own kitchen, dishes done, house quiet, children finally asleep, and is suddenly and inexplicably close to tears. Nothing has gone wrong that night, nothing she could name to a friend the next morning. And this is exactly the kind of moment Jung would ask us to take seriously rather than explain away, because the mind is quick to hunt for a cause, tiredness, hormones, a bad day, when the truer answer is often quieter and stranger, that some part of her, some old postponed hunger, a painting she stopped making, a language she meant to learn, a version of herself she quietly agreed to shelve for the sake of the household, has chosen that ordinary evening to knock. And Jung would ask you plainly, whose life is this static coming from? Because very often, it is not depression in the clinical sense. And this is not a diagnosis. It is simply the unlived self, knocking, wanting its turn, wanting to be counted among the things you actually did with your one allotted stretch of years. Think of it the way you might think of an actual locked drawer in an actual house. You do not open it for years. You walk past it so many times you stop seeing it at all, and yet the drawer does not become empty from neglect. If anything, it grows fuller, more cramped, until one day the seams themselves begin to glow, until the ordinary furniture of your life starts to feel strangely loud in its silence. And if you ignore that knocking long enough, Jung observed that it does not go away. It finds a way to happen to you instead of through you, as an illness, as a collapse, as a marriage that quietly ends, as a mood that will not lift. Fate is often simply the unlived life arriving from the outside because it was refused an entrance from within. And this is not a punishment. It is closer to a law of the psyche's own economy. What is not spent consciously is not saved. It is only deferred with interest. So let the third resolution be this. I will open the drawer I have been avoiding. I will open the drawer I have been avoiding. The fourth key is this. And here, I want to stop speaking about people in general and speak instead about you specifically. Because it is easy to nod along to the idea of the unlived life as though it belongs to some other person. Some businessman in a case study, some stranger with a more dramatic story than yours. But the unlived life does not announce itself in dramatic terms at all. It lives in the smallest hours of your actual week. So think for a moment About your own last Tuesday, not a symbolic Tuesday, the real one. Was there a small door in it that you closed without quite noticing? A thought that started, "I should call her," followed immediately and automatically by, "Not now." A feeling that rose up warm and specific, "I would love to try that," followed by, "That is not practical for someone like me." A memory of something you were once genuinely good at, some skill or curiosity from an earlier version of yourself, quietly filed away as a phase you grew out of. These are not large refusals. They do not feel like decisions at all. They feel like nothing. And that, Jung would say, is precisely why they accumulate so completely undetected. The psyche does not measure a life in a few grand gestures of courage or cowardice. It measures in the sum of 1,000 small closings, a door shutting so softly you do not even hear the latch. Imagine a woman who has wanted for years to paint again, who studied it seriously once, who still notices color and light the way a trained eye does, and who, every few months, thinks briefly of buying supplies, and just as quickly thinks of the mess, the time, the impracticality, and puts the thought down again, gently, almost tenderly, as though she were being sensible rather than absent from her own desire. Nothing dramatic happens in that moment, no crisis, no visible loss, and that is exactly the danger, because a door closed gently enough never sounds like a refusal, it sounds like maturity, it sounds like being realistic, and so it repeats, Tuesday after Tuesday, year after year, until the woman looks up one day and cannot say when she became someone who used to paint, rather than someone who paints. And here is the uncomfortable mirror this key holds up to you. If your real life feels like it is somewhere ahead of you, waiting for the right conditions, it is worth asking honestly what you are doing with the actual life directly in front of you this week. Not the imagined life after the promotion, not the one that begins once the children are grown, not the one after the debt is finally paid, the one you are living right now, on this ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday, because Jung taught that the self is not assembled out of future circumstances that have not yet arrived. It is built slowly, almost invisibly, out of what you are willing to face today, one small door at a time. And if today is mostly avoidance dressed up as patience, mostly postponement dressed up as prudence, then next year will simply be a slightly older version of the very same waiting room, the furniture rearranged, the view unchanged. So this week, notice one door you close reflexively, just one, and instead of walking past it the way you always do, stand at it for a moment. Actually stand there, and ask plainly what it was offering you. Not as a demand to fling every door open recklessly, not as an instruction to abandon your responsibilities in pursuit of every passing impulse, but as an honest and unhurried audit of how many small refusals you are making without ever having consciously decided to make them, because Jung's point was never that every impulse deserves to be acted on. It was that every impulse deserves at least to be seen, to be named, to be met with awareness, rather than dismissed by reflex. A life examined even briefly is already a different life than one lived entirely on autopilot. And let the fourth resolution be quiet and specific. Not grand, not sweeping, only exact. So speak it with me. I will notice the door before I close it. I will notice the door before I close it. The fifth key is this. Jung himself knew this collapse from the inside, not as theory but as biography. In the years after his break with Freud, around his own 38th year, he recalled in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a period where his outer life looked entirely intact, a respected practice, a family, a growing reputation, and yet inwardly he described himself as suspended in mid-air, as though the ground of his own convictions had given way beneath him. He had, by every outward measure, achieved everything the morning program could ask of a man, and still found himself facing an emptiness that no achievement touched, no patient list, no publication, no professional standing could fill it, and it was from that very collapse, not from some untroubled height of success, that he began the long private confrontation with his own unconscious that eventually produced the deepest insights of his psychology. The man who taught the world about individuation only found the path by first losing his footing entirely. And I want you to notice what this means. It means the collapse was not a detour from his real work. It was the doorway into it. And this matters enormously for you, because it means the collapse itself is not evidence that something has gone wrong with your life. It is often evidence that the morning program has simply run its full course, and the psyche is now demanding a second one, a different one it was never given before. Imagine, in this light, a man who spends 30 years building a business from nothing, who retires at last to the applause of everyone who watched him do it, and within a year finds himself hollow, irritable, sleeping badly, unable to name what is missing, standing in his own garden on a Tuesday morning, with nowhere he has to be, and feeling, for the first time in decades, entirely unnecessary. This is the kind of case Jung described in his essay on the stages of life. A man perfectly equipped for the tasks of the morning, entirely unequipped for the different, quieter, more interior tasks of the afternoon. And now imagine a second life alongside his, a woman who raised 3 children with real devotion, who organized her days for 2 decades around their needs, and who, when the last one finally leaves for a life of his own, expects something like relief, and instead finds something closer to grief. A grief with no funeral to attach it to, no one she can name it to, without sounding ungrateful. Because on paper, everything went exactly right. The children grew, they thrived, the job she set herself was completed with distinction, and still she sits in a suddenly quiet house, feeling that some enormous question has just been handed to her, with no instructions at all. Both of these people have done nothing wrong. Both of them succeeded entirely at the task they were given, and both of them are now standing at the exact threshold Jung described. The moment when the morning program finishes its work and falls silent, and the psyche, having no further use for it, refuses to hand out another set of morning instructions, because it is no longer morning. It is tempting here to reach for a phrase like the midlife crisis, as though there is a well-known clinical event waiting at a certain age to explain all this. But that phrase belongs to a later writer, Elliot Jaques, coined in 1965, and it is worth knowing plainly that Jung himself never used it. Just as the popular saying that life begins at 40 belongs not to Jung, but to Walter Pitkin, who wrote a book by that title in 1932. Jung's own claim was both humbler and far more exact. Not that life begins at some fixed number, and not that a crisis arrives on schedule like a birthday, but that the second half of life asks a genuinely different question than the first. And that question does not announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, often through exhaustion, often through an emptiness that looks from the outside like ingratitude. The first half asks, how do I build a self in the world? And it asks this honestly and rightly. There is no shame in having spent your morning answering it. But the second half asks, who is the self that was doing all that building? And that second question cannot be answered by working harder at the first one. No additional achievement, no further promotion, no better version of the same program will ever reach it, because the tool that built the house is simply not the tool that can now be asked to live in it. So if you feel the ground shifting under a life that still looks, from the outside, entirely fine, understand that this is not weakness, and it is not ingratitude, and it is not a private failure to appreciate what you have. It is the psyche closing one chapter, honestly, instead of pretending to still be writing it. And closing it honestly is a far harder and far more dignified act than simply pushing forward on momentum alone. So the fifth resolution is this: I will let the collapse of my old program be the beginning, not the end. I will let the collapse of my old program be the beginning, not the end. The sixth key is this, and it is the one that finally answers the fear hiding underneath the title of this teaching. Because when people say their real life hasn't started, what they often mean, underneath the words, is that they suspect there is nothing underneath the program at all. That if they stopped achieving, stopped proving, stopped performing the role, there would simply be an empty room where a self was supposed to be. And this fear deserves to be looked at directly, rather than soothed away. Because it is not foolish, it is in fact the exact fear that keeps the program running, long after it has stopped serving anyone. The logic goes quietly like this. If I stop moving, I will find out there was nothing here. So better to keep moving forever. Better to keep the achievements coming, the tasks filled, the calendar full, so the question never has to be asked. And Jung's whole psychology stands directly against that fear. He insisted that individuation is not the manufacturing of a new self out of nothing. It is the slow, often uncomfortable recognition of a self that was there all along, underneath the persona, underneath the morning program, underneath every performance you learned in order to be acceptable to your family and your culture. The word individuation itself points to this, becoming an individual, an undivided thing, a person no longer split between the mask worn for the world and the life quietly waiting beneath it. And this is why the afternoon of life, however disorienting, is not a lesser season than the morning. Jung said plainly that it carries a significance of its own, not a decline from the real business of youth, but a distinct task with its own dignity, the task of gathering back what was scattered in the rush to arrive somewhere, the unused talent, the postponed honesty, the buried creative impulse, the relationship you kept at arm's length because closeness felt risky. None of this needs to be manufactured fresh. It only needs to be found. And imagine, for a moment, a woman who spent 20 years being the reliable one, the one who answered every call, solved every problem at work, kept the household running without complaint, and who, arriving finally at a quiet weekend, with nothing demanded of her, felt not relief but a strange panic, because the silence had no role in it, no one to be responsible for, no performance to give. And in that silence, she found herself asking, faintly, who exactly is here, when no one needs anything from me? And Jung would say, that panic is not proof of emptiness, it is the sound of a self that has been standing patiently in a back room for 20 years, finally being addressed for the first time. And the discomfort of that moment is not a sign to flee back into busyness, it is a sign that something real is finally being approached. So consider, this week, a small experiment, not a grand reinvention, simply an evening or an hour with nothing scheduled, no task to complete, no one to please, and notice honestly what rises in that space. Boredom perhaps, restlessness perhaps, even a flicker of that same panic. And instead of immediately reaching for a distraction to fill it, sit with it a little longer than feels comfortable. Because what rises in that unstructured hour is often the closest thing you will get to a direct message from the self that has been waiting under the program this whole time. It may arrive as a memory of something you loved before you were taught to call it impractical. It may arrive as a longing with no clear object. It may arrive as grief for time that has already passed. And none of these are failures. They are simply the self, finally being given room to speak after years of being talked over by the schedule. Jung taught that this second task of life is quieter and less glamorous than the first. There is no promotion for it, no applause, no visible milestone to announce to others. It is simply the slow work of noticing what was always yours and beginning, without fanfare, to live it. A little more this year than last, and your real life, in this light, was never a locked door somewhere ahead waiting for the right key. It has been standing open this entire time, behind the performance, patient beyond all reasonable patience, asking only that you finally turn toward it. So let the sixth and final resolution be the quietest and truest one. I will meet the self I postponed, starting now. I will meet the self I postponed. Starting now. Here is the whole picture. The waiting is the symptom, not the delay. The morning program was necessary, but is not the whole of you. The unlived life does not vanish. It accumulates, and eventually insists. The small doors you close all week are the real evidence. The collapse of an old program is often the doorway to the next task, rather than proof of ruin. And the self you are waiting to become is not somewhere ahead of you being built. It is already here, patiently unlived, asking only to be met. Your real life did not fail to start. It has been running quietly the whole time, underneath the one you were performing, and the work now, gentle and unglamorous as it is simply to turn and face it,